By the time Tokyo signed the surrender on the deck of the Missouri, one British major had killed roughly 1,500 Japanese soldiers in the interior of the largest island in Asia, with 7 other white men and an alliance of headhunters who kept the count in skulls smoked black in the rafters of their longhouses. He was, by training, a birdwatcher. He had been thrown out of Harrow and out of Oxford. The British War Office had marked the country he fought over on every map printed in 1945 simply unsurveyed. And when the order came from London to come home, he refused. He stayed 9 more months. March 25, 1945. A cloud the colour of dirty wool over the Kelabit highlands of northern Borneo. 8 men step out of the side door of a Liberator bomber at 6,000 feet. Their parachutes open. The aircraft, low on fuel, banks south for Mindoro and is never seen again. Below them is a green nothing. No roads, no villages on any Allied map.
The Japanese hold the whole island.
3,000 of them between this drop zone and the sea. The man at the head of the stick lands hard in a paddy of mountain rice and breaks 2 ribs against a buffalo yoke. He gets up. He is 33 years old. Major Tom Harrison, Reconnaissance Department, Services Reconnaissance Department of the Australian Army by paperwork, Oxford ornithologist by training, Headhunters guest by stranger luck. In his left breast pocket, a flat tin of Capstan tobacco. Inside it, no tobacco. A folded square of waxed silk on which he has drawn from memory the only map of this plateau that exists in any language. What is about to happen has no English language film, no Hollywood reconstruction, almost no entry in the standard histories. 1 British major, 7 men, and a Stone Age people who eat their enemies' calves for protein will, in the next 5 months, kill more Japanese in the Borneo interior than the entire amphibious landing at Brunei Bay. The number that should not have been possible. Roughly 1,500 Japanese soldiers dead, 8 Allied losses. And when Tokyo signs the surrender on the deck of the Missouri, this small man with broken ribs and a folded silk map will refuse to come home for 9 more months. How does a birdwatcher from Oxford end up commanding 3,000 Dayak headhunters in a private war against the Imperial Japanese Army? And what does a man owe to allies who fought for him after his own government has already declared the fighting over? Tom Harnett Harrison is a hard man to describe in one line. The kind of Englishman the Empire produced when it was no longer quite sure what it wanted from one. Born in Argentina in 1911, schooled at Harrow, which threw him out. Up to Oxford, which threw him out. He goes on an ornithological expedition to the New Hebrides as a young man and stays among the people there until he runs out of money. Comes back. In 1932, at 21 years old, he leads the Oxford University Borneo expedition into the Kelabit Plateau, a place no European had spent a wet season in before. He stays 2 years. He learns the language. He eats what the people eat. He writes a book about the birds. He writes a longer, unpublished one about the people. When he sails for home in 1934, he leaves a sketch of his own face hung above a Kelabit headman's hearth, by request, in case he ever wants to find his way back. That was 11 years ago. He could not, frankly, predict that the British Empire would one day want him back. He has spent the intervening years co-founding something called mass observation, a sociological experiment in which ordinary Britons keep diaries of their own lives. He is a birdwatcher, an essayist, a drinker, a man who quarrels with his wife and his publishers in roughly equal measure. He is not anyone's idea of a soldier. Then Pearl Harbor. Then Singapore. Then the slow horror of 1942, when most of the Far East falls in 11 weeks. By 1944, the Allies are crawling back across the Pacific, island by island, and somebody in Australia opens a file and reads the words, Oxford Borneo Expedition. Somebody phones somebody. Within 6 months, Harrison is in Melbourne, under SRD, the Services Reconnaissance Department, the Australian half of the British Special Operations Executive, being briefed on a place where, to the best of Allied intelligence, no white man has set foot since he, personally, walked out of it. The plan is called Operation Semut. Semut means ant in Malay. 6 teams, none larger than 10 men, to be dropped blind into the interior of Borneo, to make contact with the indigenous peoples, to find out whether they hate the Japanese enough to fight them, and to organize that fight without giving the enemy anywhere to aim a punitive expedition. Harrison commands Semut 1. Drop zone, the Kelabit Plateau he last saw in 1934. There is no rendezvous, there is no exfiltration plan beyond the radio set he carries. There is, in his briefing folder, a single sentence about the local people, which reads, Pacification incomplete. Headhunting believed reduced, but not extinct. Reliability unknown. He folds the briefing into the bin and packs the tin of capstan tobacco. A word here about the people he is jumping in to find. The interior of northern Borneo in 1945 is not what the European mind, fed on Conrad, expects. The Kelabit, the Lun Bawang, the Iban, the Kayan, the Penan. They are rice growers and forest walkers, blacksmiths and astonishing canoe makers. They are also, in 1945, still keeping the heads of their enemies in the rafters of their longhouses, smoked black, watching the doorway. The British colonial administration, the famous White Rajas of Sarawak, has been gently discouraging the practice since the 1860s. Discouragement has had partial success. The skulls in the longhouses tend now to be old, but the men who took them are still alive, and the men, since the Japanese arrived in 1942, have been waiting for a reason to start again. Because the Japanese have been very bad guests. They have requisitioned the rice. They have taken the young women. They have publicly beheaded village headmen who refused to surrender weapons, on the slow argument that an example would teach the others. In Kuching, on the coast, they have built a camp called Batu Lintang, where they are starving Allied POWs at the rate of 15 a day. In Long Nawang, deep inland, they have machine-gunned every Dutch settler and missionary they could find, women and children included, on the slow ground that the inland tribes needed to be shown what would happen if they fed Allied stragglers. The Kelabit, the Lun Bawang, the Iban, they have been counting. They are a counting people. Every man taken, every girl taken, every headman's head laid on the path as a warning has been counted into a long mental ledger that the Japanese command, in their lofty contempt for forest people, did not imagine existed. Harrison does not know this on March 25th. He suspects it. He hopes for it. He lies in the paddy and breathes through the broken ribs for half a minute, and then he gets up and starts giving orders. 7 men land in a rough ring around him. One of them, Sergeant Frank Sanderson, an Australian gold prospector from before the war, has come down in a tree and is hanging by his harness 8 meters off the ground. 2 others, a Dutch officer named Eric Edmeades and a wireless operator named Bob Long, have landed cleanly and are gathering parachutes. The remaining 4 are spread across half a kilometre of paddy and forest edge. Nobody is dead, nobody is captured. So far, by the standards of SRD blind drops, they are having an excellent day. Then a man comes out of the tree line. He is small and barefoot and very still. His earlobes hang to his collarbones, stretched over decades by brass rings. Across his right shoulder is a parang, the long Borneo working knife, polished to the colour of river water. He looks at the 8 strangers in their green jumpsuits, takes them in the way a man takes in weather. He says nothing. Harrison knows he has perhaps 4 seconds. He raises his right hand, palm out, and uses the only word that matters. Sahabat, friend. Then a second word, older, the one he learned 11 years ago and has not spoken since. Tau Lun Nimet, the one who returns. The Kalabit man's eyes do not change. They never do, in his people. But his shoulders drop perhaps half an inch. He nods once. He turns, walks back to the tree line, and clicks his tongue. 2 more men step out of the bamboo, then 5, then 12. They come forward to help cut Sergeant Sanderson out of the tree with the same calm with which they would have cut him in half a day earlier. By dusk, the 8 allies are sitting in a longhouse on stilts on the rim of the plateau, eating boiled mountain rice with their fingers, and the headman of the longhouse, a man named WWII, is examining a sketch which Harrison has unrolled from the capstan tin. It is a map of 7 valleys and the trails between them, drawn from memory. Lawai studies it for a long minute. He turns it slightly. He puts one fingernail on a particular bend in a particular river and looks up at Harrison. And for the first time, he smiles, which, in a Kelabit, is a small lifting of the corner of the mouth, no more. And he says, in his own language, that the map is correct, except that the river has moved 50 paces in 11 years, which is what rivers do. Then he points, with the same fingernail, at the smoke-blackened rafters above their heads. There are 5 skulls up there. 3 are very old, 2 are fresh. Lawai says, in slow, careful Malay, that the fresh ones are Japanese, and that there are many more where those came from, and that the longhouses of all 7 valleys have been waiting for 3 years for someone to come back and tell them when it is permitted. Harrison, sitting cross-legged on a woven mat with 2 broken ribs and a folded silk map, and a fortnight's worth of dried rations and a wireless set that does not yet know if it can reach Australia, understands that he has just been handed a small private army of perhaps 3,000 men. He understands that nobody in Melbourne, nobody in London, nobody in any briefing he has ever sat through has prepared him for this conversation. He understands that the only honest answer, on the 8 other lives in this longhouse and on his own, is yes. He puts down his rice. He looks at WWII. He says, in the careful Malay he has been practicing on the flight up, that it is permitted, but that nothing must begin until he gives the word. He says they will need to bring the headman of the other 6 valleys here. He says it will take time, and the Japanese must not learn that he has arrived. Lawai listens. Lawai nods. Lawai sends a boy off into the dark with a single, whispered instruction. Outside the longhouse, the cloud has come down again, and the plateau has gone white and silent, the way only a tropical mountain plateau can. Somewhere far below, on the coast, the Japanese garrison at Brunei Bay is having its evening rice ration. The garrison commander does not know that 8 parachutes have come down in country he believes empty. He will not know for another 3 weeks. By the time he knows, the first 2 of his patrols will already be dead, and he will not be sure how, because the Kelabit kill very quietly, and they take only the head. In 151 days, the war will be officially over. In 160 days, the order from London will reach Tom Harrison, telling him to come out. He will not come out. He will not come out for 9 more months. But before any of that, before the siege at Long Lelang, before the silk map gets carried across 7 river crossings by a relay of children, before the moment that defines him, he has to do the harder thing first. He has to keep 3,000 men who have been waiting 3 years to start a war from starting it on the wrong day. The harder thing first. That sentence sits in his head all through the wet first night in the Longhouse, while Bob Long crouches over the Boston Type 3 wireless set and tries 17 different frequencies and gets back only static, and what he, Long, swears is the BBC Overseas Service in faint Tagalog. Harrison lies on a mat with his ribs taped under a strip of parachute silk and stares at the smoked skulls in the rafters and thinks about how, in any other war, the question would be how to start the killing. Here the question is how to stop it from starting on the wrong morning, in the wrong valley, on a Japanese patrol that turns out to be 12 men with a working radio. Because a Japanese patrol with a working radio is the entire problem of this campaign in one phrase. I should pause and explain the geography honestly, because the maps in the standard histories make it look simpler than it is. Borneo, in 1945, is the 3rd largest island on the planet. Most of its interior is folded mountain rainforest, so steep that a fit man covers maybe 8 kilometers in a day on the trails the Dayaks know, and roughly 0 on the trails they do not. The Japanese have garrisoned the coast. Brunei, Miri, Kuching, Sandakan, Tarakan, Balikpapan, the oil fields, the airfields, and they have a thin chain of inland posts along the rivers, manned by the kind of men a winning army sends inland, and the kind of men a losing army has nobody left to send. By March of 45, they are, on the whole map, the losing army. They do not yet know it on the Trusan River. On the Trusan, they are still requisitioning rice. What Tom Harrison has in his head is a thing the Japanese do not have. He has the inside of the island. He has, from his 1932 expedition, a working memory of which trail crosses which ridge to which longhouse, which river is wadable in May, which one becomes a brown, roaring nothing in November. He has the names of headmen, some of whom are dead now, but whose sons remember the Birdwatcher who could drink the rice wine without making a face. He has, above all, the silk map. The silk map is not a navigational chart. It is, frankly, a working sociology. It tells him where the alliances are, which longhouse has the old feud with which longhouse, which village can be trusted to feed a stranger, and which one will agree to feed the stranger and then send a runner to the Japanese garrison the same evening. He sits with the map across his knees on the second night, and he goes through it with WWII Bisarai longhouse by longhouse. And WWII corrects him. In 11 years, some headmen have died, and some sons have not turned out like their fathers, and some villages have been moved by the Japanese to the coast as forced labor, and some have been quietly burned in retaliation for nothing. This is the work of the first week, drawing the new map on top of the old map. By the end of the second week, runners have gone out to the 6 other valleys with the small instruction, "Come to the rim of the plateau. The man from before the war has come back." By the end of the third week, 22 headmen are sitting in WWII's longhouse with their parangs across their knees, drinking the rice wine called borak in the slow, ceremonious way of the highlands. And Harrison is speaking to them, through WWII, in the Malay they all share. He says three things. The first thing is that the Japanese will lose this war. The men in the longhouse already believe this. They have believed it since the first ration was taken from them. They are pleased that the Englishman believes it too. The second thing is that they will lose it faster if the Dayak peoples kill them on the trails, in the boats, in the rice stores, everywhere except in their own garrisons. The men in the longhouse like this. They like it more than the rice wine. The third thing is harder. The third thing is that nobody starts before he, the Englishman, gives the word. Because if a patrol disappears today, a punitive column comes tomorrow, and the column will not march into the longhouse of the men who took the patrol. The column will march into the nearest longhouse, the easiest one, and burn it with the women and the children in it. And that longhouse will probably belong to a man who has not yet agreed to anything. The headmen look at each other. They are not used to being asked to wait. They have been waiting, in their own counting, for 37 months.
But they recognize the logic.
They have seen the column come into the wrong village before. They agree with the kind of slow, grudging agreement that headmen give a man who is asking the right thing in the wrong tense. They agree, in the working summary, that the Englishman has the word. Now, about me, about my own honest position on what I am telling you, because at this point in the story, it matters. I have been working from Harrison's own book, World Within, which he wrote in 1959, and which is a strange and partial document, half memoir and half ethnography, and entirely the work of a man who quarreled with everyone who tried to edit it. I have been working from the SRD operational reports as they were declassified in the 1980s, and as Bob Long's son later put them online. I have been working also from the oral histories collected from elderly Lun Bawang and Kelabit men in the 1990s by Sarawak Museum staff, in which the same events are described in quite different language and with quite different protagonists. The Dayak version of this story is not the same as the British version of this story. Where they disagree, I will say so, and I will lean toward whichever account fits the verifiable thing. The dates in the SRD logbook, the rice rations recorded by the Japanese commissary on the coast, the names of dead patrol leaders that appear in the post-war Tokyo war crimes file on Borneo. Where I am guessing, I will say, I am guessing. Right. The first ambush. The first ambush is on April the 18th, 1945, on a trail running south from the Trusan River toward an inland post called Lawas. A Japanese patrol of 9 men is moving in single file with their bolt-action Arisaka rifles slung across their backs. They are not nervous particularly. They have done this trail 8 times this year. The trail goes through bamboo for about 3 kilometers, and then through what the Kelabit call the White Forest, where the canopy is so high that the daylight comes down green. The patrol enters the White Forest at about 11 in the morning. 9 men go in. None come out. What happens in the White Forest is, in essence, what happens in every Dayak ambush of this campaign. The patrol is allowed to move maybe 400 meters into the high canopy. The trail narrows. The men in front and the men at the rear are out of sight of each other. A blowpipe dart tipped with the sap of the upas tree, hits the lead man in the side of the neck. He does not even know he has been hit. He stops, puts a hand to his neck, looks at his fingers, and folds down slowly, the way a man folds when his legs have stopped getting messages. The man behind him has perhaps 2 seconds to lift his rifle. A parang takes him below the ear. The patrol's discipline, which is good, holds for the first 4 seconds and then breaks because nobody knows where the threat is coming from, and by the time they have begun to fire wildly into the canopy, they are already 4 corpses lighter, and the Kelabit, who are by no means superstitious about firearms, have stripped the rifles and the bandoliers from the first 4 men and are using them to finish the rest. 9 men go in. None come out. The Kelabit lose nobody. They take 9 heads. They bury the bodies, with the rifles, in 3 separate pits, half a kilometer apart, so that no future Japanese tracking expedition can read the trail back to a single longhouse. Then, they send a boy with the news to Harrison, who is 40 kilometers away by trail at a place called Borneo, where he has set up the first proper SRD inland base on a slope above a rice paddy, with the wireless aerial slung between 2 breadfruit trees. The boy is 12. He runs the 40 kilometers in 2.5 days. When he arrives, he is given fresh rice and a piece of dried buffalo, and he tells the news to WWII's youngest son, who tells Harrison in Malay, and Harrison writes, in his green field notebook, the words, "First contact," and underlines them twice, and then crosses out the second underline because he is, even now, a man who edits himself. He does not yet know whether this is a victory or a disaster. Because the question of the disaster, the punitive column that he has been trying to prevent, is still open. The Japanese at Lawas will, within 48 hours, notice that a patrol of 9 men has not come back. They will send a runner to Brunei Bay. Brunei Bay will, with the methodical fury that the Imperial Japanese Army applies to anything that disrupts its dignity, dispatch a stronger column. The stronger column will march up the Truson, looking for someone to punish. Harrison sits in his Barrio base camp and waits for the column. He has, by this point, the 7 men he came in with, plus a corporal named Sochon, who came in on a separate drop 10 days later with a second wireless and a Bren gun. The Bren gun is the only proper Allied automatic weapon on the plateau. It is also, Sochon discovers on day 2, jammed solid by the wet, the action gummed shut with the kind of fine green mold that grows on metal in a Borneo wet season inside 72 hours. Sochon spends an evening with the gun broken down on a banana leaf, picking mold out of the bolt carrier with a needle. He has no proper gun oil. He has palm oil from the kitchen of the longhouse, which is what people on the plateau use for everything, and he reasons that palm oil is at least an oil. He swabs every working surface. He reassembles the gun. He fires a single test round into a banana trunk at 20 meters. The boat cycles. The Bren is alive again. Sochon writes in his own notebook the words, "Palm oil works." This sentence, "palm oil works," is going to matter in 2.5 months. But the column, when it comes, does not come where Harrison is expecting it. It does not come up the Truson, because the Japanese commander at Brunei Bay, after a day of thinking, decides that a patrol that has vanished without a single shot reported is probably not a partisan ambush at all. The Kelabit are, in his own intelligence picture, peaceful forest people who have given his garrison no trouble in 3 years. The patrol, he concludes, has probably been eaten by a crocodile in the Truson crossing, or, more likely, has deserted en masse, which Japanese patrols on Borneo in the spring of 1945 do not in fact do, but which the commander is willing to believe because it requires him to do nothing. He logs the 9 men as missing in unclear circumstances. He does not send a column.
When Harrison realizes,
4 weeks later, that no column is coming, he has the strangest experience of the campaign so far. He understands, sitting on a log in front of the wireless aerial at Barrio, that the Japanese have already, secretly, half given up on the interior of their own occupied island. They are no longer hunting in it, they are merely holding the coast and pretending the interior is still theirs. The plateau is, in practical fact, his. He sits on the log for a long time. Bob Long comes over and asks if he is all right. Harrison, who is in many ways a difficult man and was a difficult boy at Harrow and will be a difficult husband to several wives, gives Long the answer that defines the next 4 months of the campaign. He says, "We are going to take this whole island back, one trail at a time, and they are not going to know they have lost it until we tell them." The wireless that evening reaches Australia for the first time. Bob Long sends a 4-word message in cipher.
Simut 1,
Alive, Barrio. The reply comes back inside an hour. It is a single word. Continue. A note about timing, because this is the moment in the story where the dates start to compress, and a viewer who has been following carefully will want to keep them straight. The drop is March 25th. The first ambush is April the 18th, 24 days later. The first radio contact with Australia is May the 20th, 56 days after the drop. By May, the war in Europe is over. Berlin has fallen on May the 2nd, and Germany has signed the surrender at Reims on May the 7th. The men in the longhouses on the Kelabit Plateau do not know this. They will not know it for several more weeks. Harrison knows it from the wireless. He does not tell them because the news from Europe is, on the plateau, a kind of information that has no useful shape. The men want to know when the Englishman will land on the coast of their island. He does not yet know. Through May and into June, Operation Samut grows. More drops come in. By the end of May, there are roughly 40 Allied soldiers on the plateau, spread across the 7 valleys, each of them living with a longhouse and training the men of that longhouse in the use of the rifles taken from the Japanese in the first ambushes. The training is two-way. The Allies teach the use of the iron sights and the proper care of the bolt action. The Dayaks teach the Allies to walk on a rainforest trail without making the sound a stranger makes, to read the bend of a leaf for the direction a man passed, to drink the borak in the right manner so as not to insult the host. Some of the training is, frankly, comic. There is a young Australian named Pinkerton, 22 years old, who is convinced he can teach a Lun Bawang warrior of 50 years' experience how to set a snare. The Lun Bawang lets him try for 3 days, with the patience of a man watching a small child fail at boiling water, and then, on the 4th day, sets a snare of his own, which catches a wild pig at sunrise. Pinkerton, who is not a stupid boy, eats his portion of the pig and asks his teacher, through WWII's son, to teach him again. The lesson is granted. By the end of June, Pinkerton can set a snare that catches things, and the Lun Bawang warriors call him, with the affection they would give a slow but trying son, the boy who finally learned. This is how the army builds itself, not on a parade ground, in longhouses over barack, by failure. By the end of June, in the Count Harrison keeps in his green notebook, the Dayak partisans across the 7 valleys of the Kelabit Plateau and the 4 valleys of the Lun Bawang country have killed, by ambush and by knife, and in 2 cases by deadfall trap, somewhere between 200 and 300 Japanese soldiers. The exact figure varies depending on whose count you accept. The Dayaks count heads, which is the most reliable form of counting. The British count rifles recovered, which is a slightly lower number because heads do not always come with rifles. By either count, it is more than a battalion's worth of casualties in 2 months, in an area which the Japanese command at Brunei Bay still believes is quiet. Then, on June the 10th, the Australian 9th Division lands on the coast at Brunei Bay. This is the part of the Borneo campaign that does appear in the histories. 2 divisions of Australian infantry, supported by American carrier aircraft, come ashore in the largest amphibious operation Australia has ever mounted. The Japanese garrisons on the coast fight in the rigid, bitter way Japanese coastal garrisons fight in 1945, and they are pushed inland from the beaches in about a week. They are pushed inland into the country which, unbeknown to them, and largely unbeknown to the Australian commanders on the beach, belongs already to Tom Harrison and his Dayak army. The Japanese, retreating from the coast into the interior, walk into the White Forest with no map of who is in it. What happens to them between mid-June and the middle of August is the central thing the histories do not describe at any length, because no Australian war correspondent went into the Highlands to watch it, and Harrison's own write-up, in World Within, is deliberately understated for reasons I will come to in the final part of this story. What happens, in summary, is that the Japanese retreat from the coast becomes a Japanese annihilation in the forest. Patrols of 50, 60, 80 men march inland, looking for a way back to their inland posts, and find instead narrow trails with quiet bamboo on either side, and they enter the bamboo and they do not come out. Whole companies disappear. By the middle of July, Japanese officers on the coast are reporting to Brunei Bay that the interior of northern Borneo is not, as previously assumed, empty country, but is instead full of a kind of enemy they cannot see, and cannot fix, and cannot count. They are not wrong. The figure for the campaign, as Harrison would later give it in his accounting, is roughly 1,500 Japanese dead in the interior between March and August against 8 Allied losses. The 8 Allied losses are all of them men of Operation Samut. None of them are Dayaks. The Dayaks lose, depending on whose count you use, between 40 and 70 men over the same period, mostly to ambushes that turned, mostly when a Japanese unit larger than expected was met on a trail. The disproportion is so large that, frankly, no Allied staff officer who saw the early figures believed them. A signal goes from Australia to Harrison at Borneo in early July, asking him to recount. He recounts. He sends back the same figures with 3 more digits of precision. The staff officer in Melbourne lets the matter drop. By the end of July, Harrison is no longer fighting a partisan campaign. He is, in functional terms, the military governor of an area roughly the size of Belgium. Headmen come to Borneo to ask him to settle disputes that have nothing to do with the war. A Lun Bawang family wants permission to move from one valley to another because a flood has destroyed their rice store, and the headman of the receiving valley wants the Englishman's word on it. Harrison gives the word. A Kelabit man wants permission to marry a girl from a longhouse that his grandfather's grandfather had a feud with, and the 2 headmen come to ask the Englishman to mediate. Harrison mediates. He is, by mid-July, doing the job that the British colonial administration of Sarawak did before the war, and he is doing it from a longhouse on a hill above a rice paddy, with a wireless aerial and a Bren gun that runs on palm oil. In the evenings, he writes in his green notebook. Some of the writing is operational, some of it, to his own surprise, is ornithology. He has begun, in the 3rd month of his impossible private war, to note the birds. He records a hornbill he has not seen since 1933. He records the song of a thrush that he thinks may be undescribed. He has, folded inside the notebook, a thin sheaf of pages bound with parachute cord, the birdskin notes from his Oxford expedition, which he has been carrying through the war, the same way he has been carrying the Capstan tobacco tin. The notes are 11 years old. They are written in a younger man's hand. Harrison reads them sometimes by the kerosene lamp in the longhouse, and he is aware, in the way a man is aware of weather, that the younger man who wrote them and the older man rereading them are not quite the same person, and that the difference is being measured in Japanese dead. Then, in the first days of August, 2 pieces of news arrive in the same week. The first is that a column of Japanese soldiers, roughly 300 strong, is moving up the Trusan toward the inland post at Long Lelang. They are not a patrol. They are the remnant of a coastal garrison that has decided, against orders, to walk inland and try to break through to the Dutch side of the island, where they believe other Japanese forces are still holding. They are armed. They are starving. They have 1 functioning mountain gun. They have with them a column of conscripted Javanese laborers, and perhaps 15 women they have taken from a coastal village. They are, in the operational summary, the largest single Japanese force ever to enter the Kelabit Plateau in the war. The second piece of news, which reaches Borneo on the 8th of August by wireless from Australia, is that a new kind of bomb has been dropped on a Japanese city called Hiroshima. Harrison, sitting in his longhouse with the green notebook open on his knees, looks at the 2 pieces of news for a long time. He understands very clearly that the war is about to be over. He understands equally clearly that 300 Japanese soldiers with a mountain gun are moving up the Trusan, and that, in 5 days, they will be at Long Lelang. He understands that if they reach Long Lelang, they will burn it with the 70-odd Kelabit women and children who live in it, because that is what the column has been doing in every village it has passed through on the way up the river. He understands that the war ending in Tokyo will not by itself stop a column 300 kilometers inland on a rainforest trail. He understands that the only thing that will stop the column is him. He closes the notebook. He calls in Lawai Bisarai. He says in Malay 3 words, "Bring the headmen." And he gets ready, with 8 Australians and a Dutch officer and a wireless that has just received the news of Hiroshima and a Bren gun that runs on palm oil, and roughly 3,000 Dayak warriors who have been waiting 4 months and 12 days to do the thing that the British histories of Borneo, when they mention it at all, mention in a single paragraph and a half. The thing the Kelabit, in their oral histories, call simply the long week at Long Lelang. Long Lelang sits on a bend in the upper Trusan. It is a single longhouse, the way most Kelabit villages are, 82 meters along, raised on hardwood piles, with 31 apartment compartments under 1 bark roof. 73 people live in it. Most of them are women, children, and old men. The young men, the warriors, are at this point spread across the campaign, some with Harrison's detachments to the south, some up in the high passes, some on patrol along the headwaters where the Trusan stops being a river and starts being a chain of pools. The post itself, the Japanese post the column is marching toward, is not actually at Long Lelang. It is 2 kilometers south, on a flat above the river, an abandoned coffee-collecting shed from the colonial period that the Japanese had occupied for a year and then quietly withdrawn from in March, when the news of the Australian landings on the islands to the east first reached Brunei Bay. The column under the senior Japanese officer, a captain whose name does not survive in the SRD logbook in any reliable form. Lawai's son later remembered it as something that sounded to him like Kobayashi. But the post-war Tokyo files give a different name for the officer commanding that particular coastal garrison, and I will not pretend to know. The captain, anyway, is marching for the abandoned post on the strength of 14-month-old intelligence. He believes there is rice stockpiled there. He believes there is a wireless. He believes that, from Long Lelang, he can cross the watershed into Dutch Borneo in 5 days. He is wrong about the rice. He is wrong about the wireless. He is wrong, most importantly, about how long it will take to reach Long Lelang, because he is walking up a river valley in which every bamboo grove is, by this point in August, an ambush position with a name. I want to slow down here because the Long Lelang week is the moment the whole campaign turns from a guerrilla operation into a moral problem, and a viewer should see, in the right order, the choices Harrison actually makes. Choice the first. He does not immediately attack the column. This may seem strange, given that the column is heading for a longhouse full of women and children he is, by the slow logic of his alliance with WWII, sworn to protect. But Harrison does the maths in his green notebook on the evening of August the 9th, by kerosene lamp, and the maths is not encouraging. 300 Japanese, armed, with a mountain gun. His own force on the Upper Trusan, the force he can concentrate in 2 days, is 8 allies and perhaps 400 Dayak warriors. The allies have the Bren, which still, thanks to the Corporal Sochon, runs on palm oil, and roughly 900 rounds. The Dayaks have rifles taken from earlier ambushes, perhaps 110 of them, of which roughly 70 are in working order, and an unknown quantity of ammunition, because each man hoards his own. They have a great many parangs and a great many blowpipes. They have, in the country between the column and the longhouse, perhaps 30 kilometers of trail. 30 kilometers on a Borneo rainforest river path in the wet, with a wounded column trying to make haste. That is, by Harrison's reading, 4 days of march. 4 days in which the trail can be made to do work. Choice the second. He evacuates Long Lelang first. He sends a runner, a boy, again, 12 years old. The runners are always boys, partly because the Kelabit elders consider it good training for a future man, and partly because boys, in a forest, are quieter than adults and harder for a Japanese sentry to take seriously when they pass at a distance. He sends a runner south to Long Lelang with the order to move the 73 inhabitants out of the longhouse and into a temporary camp 2 ridges away, taking the rice stores and the pigs and the chickens, but leaving the longhouse itself standing and lit at night, so that the column, when it arrives, will see an apparently inhabited village. He does this because if the column finds the longhouse empty, it will turn around earlier, and an earlier turnaround, by his calculation, will scatter the Japanese back down the river in small groups, which is harder to deal with than one large group that thinks it is winning. Hard reasoning, cold reasoning. It is the reasoning of a man who has, in 4 months, become a different man from the birdwatcher who came down in the rice paddy on March the 25th. Choice the third. He calls in the Dayaks from the other 6 valleys. Runners go out on the morning of August the 10th. The summons, in the careful protocol WWII has helped him develop, names no place and no date. It says only that the Englishman asks the headman to send what they can spare to the Upper Truson within 4 days, in the old manner, by the old paths. The headmen understand. By the evening of August the 12th, perhaps 1,100 Dayak warriors are moving down the river valleys toward the Upper Truson, in small groups, on trails that no Japanese reconnaissance has ever walked. They do not move on the river path itself. They move along the ridges above it, in the canopy, where the column cannot see them, and where, for the most part, the column does not even know to look. Meanwhile, the column, on the river path, is making between 6 and 7 kilometers a day, slower than the Japanese captain hoped. He is losing men on the way, not to ambush, but to fever, and to dysentery, and to the slow attrition that a Borneo wet season inflicts on coastal garrison troops who have not, in 3 years, walked further than the perimeter of a barracks. By the morning of August the 13th, the column is perhaps 270 effective, with the mountain gun being dragged by 10 men in shifts, the Javanese labourers who, by this point, have been quietly reduced to about 20 because the rest have either died on the trail or slipped away at night into the forest, which is, for a forced labourer in 1945 Borneo, almost the same thing as dying, except sometimes not. Anyway, the column is in worse shape than its captain knows, because the captain is on the 2nd day of a malaria he is not admitting to. I'm going to be honest now about a thing the British accounts of this story leave out. The Dayak warriors, moving down the ridges above the river on the 12th and 13th of August, are not principally there to liberate Long Lelang. They are there to take heads. They have been waiting, in the count their headmen keep, for 39 months. They have agreed, all spring and all summer, to do this in the disciplined Englishman's way, which is to say, in coordinated ambushes that protect specific longhouses and that follow specific signals. They have not, in those 4 months, broken the agreement once. But the Long Lelang column is the largest single target of the war, and the men coming down the ridges, when they reach their positions on the night of August the 13th, are in a different mood from the men who set the first ambush at Lawas in April. Harrison, at his forward position on a saddle 2 kilometers above the post, with Sochon and the Bren and the wireless, and WWII beside him on a log, understands the mood. He can hear it in the silence of the men around him. He can read it in the way the parangs are being oiled. He understands that if he gives the signal in the standard way, 3 short blasts on a brass whistle, the signal that has worked all summer for ambushes of 8 or 12 Japanese on a single trail. What will follow will not be an ambush. It will be a slaughter. 300 armed Japanese against 1,100 Dayaks who have been waiting 3 years. The mountain gun will get off perhaps 3 rounds before it is taken. The bolt-action Arisakas will get off perhaps 2 volleys before the men holding them are dead. After that, in the wet bamboo, on a moonless August night on the Upper Truson, what will happen in the old way, by parang and by blowpipe and by hand, and the heads will be taken, and there will be no Japanese left to surrender. Choice the fourth. This is the moral turn of the story. Harrison sits on the log for a long time. WWII does not press him. The Dayaks do not press him. They are waiting for the whistle. They will be patient for one more night because he has earned, through 4 months, the right to ask for one more night of patience. Then, around midnight on the 13th of August, the wireless at Barrio, which Bob Long has been listening to in shifts of 2 hours since the news of Hiroshima came in 5 days earlier, picks up a faint, open-text broadcast in English from the BBC Overseas Service. The broadcast says that a second city has been bombed. The broadcast says, in the careful voice of an announcer who does not yet know how to say what he is being asked to say, that the second city is called Nagasaki. The broadcast says, with the kind of cautious official optimism that turned out this time to be correct, that the Japanese government is now believed to be considering surrender. A boy carries the message to Harrison on the saddle by dawn. Harrison reads it twice in the green notebook. He shows it to WWII. He explains in Malay what a city being bombed in 1 minute by one aeroplane means. WWII is silent for a while. Then he says, in the language of a man who has spent his life accounting for cause and effect, that he understands that the war is ending, and he understands that the men in the column probably do not yet know it, and he asks, politely, whether the Englishman intends to tell them. Harrison looks at him for a long moment. He says, in the careful Malay he has been using all summer, yes. This is the choice. This is the thing he does that the British histories cannot quite digest, and that the Dayak oral histories regard with a respect that has, even now, a small edge of incomprehension. He does not let the ambush happen. He sends, instead, a runner down the trail toward the column, under a piece of parachute silk tied to a stick, with a written message in formal Japanese. The message has been drafted, in the Longhouse, by a Dutch officer named Edmeades, who learned the language as a boy in the Indies. The message says that the bearer is a parliamentarian of the Allied forces, that the war is in the process of ending, and that the captain of the column is invited to send his own parliamentarian to a meeting at first light on August the 15th, at a point on the trail to be specified, to discuss the terms under which the column can lay down its arms without further loss of life. The runner is, again, a boy. 16 this time, not 12, because the message has to be carried with a stick and not a parang, and the captain has to take the boy seriously. The boy walks down the trail in the dawn of August the 14th with the white silk on the stick, and a Kelabite elder 40 paces behind him for moral cover, and he reaches the head of the Japanese column at about 9 in the morning. The captain of the column reads the message. He vomits, from the malaria and from the news. He calls his own staff together. They argue in front of the boy, who waits, in the manner taught to him by his grandfather, by becoming the next thing to invisible. The Japanese staff cannot agree. Half of them want to shoot the boy and continue. Half of them, the half who have been listening to the wireless their own column carries when it works, which is not often, want to send a parliamentarian. The captain, on the strength of 2 arguments, the malaria, which he can no longer hide, and the fact that he has been watching his column lose men to a forest he cannot see into, and would now, if anything, like a reason to stop walking up this river forever. The captain orders his own parliamentarian forward. At first light on the 15th of August, on a flat stone on the riverbank, the captain of the column and Major Tom Harrison of the Service's Reconnaissance Department sit on a log opposite each other and negotiate the surrender of approximately 240 effective Japanese soldiers in the highlands of northern Borneo. The mountain gun is to be left in place with its breech block removed. The rifles are to be stacked. The Javanese laborers and the 15 women from the coastal village are to be released immediately into the protection of the Lun Bawang headman, whose territory the stone is in. The Japanese soldiers are to march, unarmed and under escort, back down the Trusan to Brunei Bay, where they will be handed over to the regular Australian forces who have occupied the coast. The captain agrees. He agrees mostly because Harrison has the courtesy on the riverbank, not to mention the 1,100 Dayak warriors who are, at this moment, in the canopy above them on both banks of the river, watching the negotiation with the bored patience of men who have been told they will not, after all, take heads today. The surrender is formally accepted at 14 minutes past 7 in the morning, August 15th, 1945. Tokyo, of course, surrenders the same day. The two events are not connected. The Japanese officer on the log at Long Lilang does not know about Tokyo. He will not know for another 4 days. Harrison, who does know from the BBC, does not tell him, because the formal Allied announcement has not yet been made, and Harrison is a man who, even here, in the 11th month of an impossible private war, behaves with the kind of correctness that he absorbed at Harrow before he was thrown out of it. That should be the end of the story. It is not the end. What happens next is the thing that, in my judgment, makes Tom Harrison worth the hour of your attention. The war is over. The Allies have won. The official Japanese surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay is signed on September the 2nd. The order goes out from London and from Melbourne and from the headquarters of the British Borneo Civil Affairs Unit, which has just reactivated itself in Brunei Bay, that all special operations personnel are to withdraw from inland positions, hand over their wirelesses and any captured weapons, and report for processing toward demobilization. Harrison does not. The order reaches him at Barrio on September the 7th, brought in by a relay of boys from a wireless at Long Lilang. He reads it. He folds it into the green notebook. He does not reply. A second order, more sternly worded, reaches him on September the 15th. He reads that one too. He sends back, by wireless, a 4-word message. Local situation requires presence. The reason the local situation requires his presence is the thing the British administration in Brunei Bay does not yet understand, sitting on the coast in its requisitioned colonial offices. The reason is that across northern Borneo there are still, in September of 1945, between 4,000 and 6,000 Japanese soldiers in the interior, in small groups, on the trails, who do not know the war is over, or who know, but who have decided that surrender is dishonorable, or who are simply lost and starving and dangerous in the way starving armed men are dangerous everywhere. The British administration on the coast regards these men as a tidying problem to be sorted out in due course by regular forces. The Dayaks of the interior, in their longhouses, regard them as walking and unfinished business. If the British leave the interior now, every Japanese straggler who comes out of a forest path into a Kelabit longhouse in the next 9 months will lose his head. By the end of the wet season, several thousand Japanese stragglers will be dead, so in all likelihood will several hundred Dayaks, because some of the stragglers are organized enough and armed enough to fight back. Harrison understands this. He understands that the alliance he has built across the 7 valleys is, by old longhouse custom, a debt he owes both ways. The Dayaks fought for him when the alliance required them to fight. Now the alliance requires him to keep them from fighting when fighting is no longer necessary. He understands that this is a job that cannot be done by a colonial officer who arrives in October from London with a memorandum. It can only be done by the man whose word the headmen have, in fact, been waiting for since April. So he stays. He stays through September. He stays through October. He stays through the wet season,
the November,
and the December, and the January, when the rivers are brown and the trails are impassable to anyone who does not know them. He goes from longhouse to longhouse, with WWII or Lawai's son beside him as interpreter, and he explains again and again that the war is over, and that men who walk out of the forest with their hands open are not to be killed. He explains that men who walk out with weapons are to be disarmed and brought to the nearest Allied post, alive, and that the headman who delivers a Japanese alive will be remembered. In the formal way, the Kelabit remember debts, in the same ledger as the headman who delivered a head 3 months earlier. He explains with great patience that taking a head from a man who is no longer fighting is not, in the Englishman's accounting, the same act as taking a head from a man who is. The headmen listen. The headmen do not, on the whole, agree. They have their own accounting, which has been kept for 39 months and is not finished. But they accept the Englishman's word, because they gave their word to him in April and have not broken it once, and they will not break it now. Over the autumn and winter of 1945, more than 900 Japanese soldiers walk out of the highlands of northern Borneo alive. They walk out because Tom Harrison and 7 other men refuse to leave their post when the war ends. The men who walk out are processed at the coast and in due course repatriated to a Japan that has not yet, in the autumn of 1945, fully understood what it has done to itself and to the world. The men who walked out almost certainly did not know, and would not have particularly cared, that the reason they were alive was a 33-year-old English ornithologist who had refused his own demobilization order to keep an alliance with a people they had been ordered 3 years earlier to treat with the deepest contempt. That is the moral turn of the story. There is a coda. Harrison finally walks out of the Kelabit Plateau in March of 1946. The family papers say April, the SRD logbook says March. I have not been able to reconcile the two. The difference is probably a question of when he last touched the wireless versus when he last touched a coast road. He goes back to England. He resumes the life of a birdwatcher and a sociologist and a quarrelsome man. He writes, eventually, 2 books about Borneo, one about the birds and one called World Within, which is the source for most of what we know about the campaign and which is, as I mentioned earlier, deliberately understated about the killing. He does not mention in World Within the figure 1,500. He mentions, when pressed, that there were a great many Japanese casualties in the interior. He is asked in his old age by an Australian journalist why he did not press for the higher figure. He says, in a sentence that is the last serious sentence on the record from him about this campaign, that the dead were not his to count. He returns to Borneo many times. He becomes the curator of the Sarawak Museum. He marries again and again. He dies in 1976 in a road accident in Thailand at 64. He is buried by his own request in Sarawak. The capstan tobacco tin, with the silk map folded inside it, ends up, by the standard route of Harrison's personal effects, in one of the British ethnographic collections that holds his Borneo papers. It is not, when you find it, prominently labelled, in the way ethnographic museums in Britain like to leave the strange objects unlabelled, on the slow ground that the labels would not, in any case, quite tell the truth. The Kelabit, in their longhouses, still know the word, Tau Lun Nimet, the one who returns. Loai Bisarai's grandson, an old man now, told a Sarawak Museum interviewer in 2004 that the word, in the proper old usage, did not just mean a person who comes back. It meant a person who comes back when he is owed. That is what I want you to take from this. Not the 1,500 dead. Not the 8 to 70 losses on his own side. Not the mountain gun left on the riverbank at Long Lelang on the morning of August 15th. But the fact that a 33-year-old birdwatcher from Oxford, in the wet of a Borneo September, with a war already officially won, looked at an old debt to people his own empire had spent 80 years gently misunderstanding, and decided that the debt was the more serious thing. He stayed 9 months past the surrender. He kept the alliance the way an alliance is supposed to be kept. He came back when he was owed. The kind of small, unfashionable virtue that loses you the Harrow Prize and gains you, in the upper canopy of a forest most maps do not show, the only kind of trust that in the end anyone keeps.